Welcome to Signs of Life, exploring survival of consciousness. Brought to you by Forever Family Foundation, on the web at foreverfamilyfoundation.org.
I call your name, the echo is haunting, the echo is always the same. I call your name, the echo is haunting, an echo can never be changed, so I call your name, your name.
And welcome to Signs of Life Radio. I'm Bob Ginsberg. Welcome to the show. Well, we're waiting for our guest to arrive. We had a great guest who wrote a terrific book. His name is Dan Drasin. He's a producer and a filmmaker, and he made two excellent feature documentaries, Calling Earth and SCOLE, the Afterlife Experiment. And his book is A New Science of the Afterlife, Space, Time, and the Consciousness Code. His website is Dan Drasin, DRASIN.com. So I will let you know when he shows up. I mean, meanwhile, as long as we're together, if you had any questions about anything, feel free to give us a call at 888-627-6008. This is typically just an interview show, so we didn't request any questions. So if you'd like to call with one, go ahead. What brought me to Dan originally, it was about 10 years ago. He produced a documentary called Calling Earth, and it's all about electronic voice phenomena and instrumental transcommunication. And for those of you who are not familiar, it's a process by which those in spirit can imprint their voice onto recording devices, which sounds incredible, but yet people have been doing this for decades now. And if you get a chance to watch that documentary, Calling Earth, you might be amazed, at the evidence that's picked up by various devices, direct communications from discarnates, those in the spirit world. It's one of those things, like a lot of the things that we talk about when we talk about electronic voice phenomena, that it's almost too good to be true. How, you say, how does somebody in spirit that doesn't have a body and doesn't have a voice box imprint a voice, but we're thinking in physical terms, and I see our guest is here, so I'm going to admit him. Hey, Dan.
Hi, Bob.
Hi.
So sorry. I was called away in an emergency and just got back in. Please forgive me for being late.
Okay. Well, let me introduce you. We were talking a little bit about your work and specifically electronic voice phenomena. But Dan Drasin is a media producer, a filmmaker, photographer, audio producer, and a writer. He has an abiding interest in finding more expansive and penetrating ways of perceiving reality and advancing our compassionate understanding of ourselves, our world, and our universe. He's been doing this now for over 6 decades, and films that he produced or photographed have earned 24 international awards. He's produced 2 excellent feature documentaries, Calling Earth and SCOLE, the Afterlife Experiment. We'll be talking a little bit about SCOLE. He's also the author of a very good book, A New Science of the Afterlife, Space, Time, and the Consciousness Code. And Dan's website is Dan Drasin, DRASIN.com. It's a pleasure to have you here with us, Dan.
Thank you, Bob. And I just wanted to, while we're singing praises, I just wanted to praise you as well for all the wonderful work you've been doing over the years.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. The first question is always, I'm curious. I know how I got into this kind of work per se, out of personal tragedy. Was there any particular experience in your life that compelled you to study non-physical phenomena? Was it something that you, as a child or as a teen, you had thought about?
Well, yeah, as a child, excuse me, as a child, at some point I started experiencing precognitive dreams, and that I didn't understand what that was about, but it gave me it was a good lesson to me to indicate that in the theater of life, stuff goes on backstage. That there were presences and forces and so on at work that were beyond the scope of our senses and also of our scientific instruments of the time. So that was interesting. You know, space and time were not quite what we perceived them to be. Then, actually, also in my childhood, I became quite fascinated with the UFO phenomenon, which this was way back in the 1940s. And that was before the curtain of secrecy and ridicule had come down. And people could speak about it. It was a curiosity that folks spoke about openly. And in fact, there was a radio announcer, a newscaster in New York, a major radio station in New York that I listened to at the time, who gave UFO sighting and landing reports on his evening newscast. And on one occasion, he reported a sighting and a landing at the Fort Dix military reservation, which was not far from where I lived at the time in central New Jersey. And when I heard this report, I thought, oh, my people are coming back.
Your people.
Yeah, now where did that come from? I have no idea.
Right.
And I just mentioned it to my grandparents who were raising me at the time, and they said, "Oh, this is a bunch of nonsense." So I very, very quickly learned to keep it under wraps. And until a little later, I read just about everything that had been published on that subject. And fast forward to this is quite a bit forward to the 1990s, from the 1940s to the 1990s. After an abiding interest in all things paranormal, I discovered the work of Robert Monroe and his work in out-of-body experiences. This led to, excuse me, a meeting with Mark Macy, who was an EVP experimenter and author. And he showed me a book that he had co-written. And I was a bit suspicious at first. I thought, well, is the CIA bugging people's recorders, things like that? And I'm not normally that skeptical about not sort of blatantly skeptical, but I quickly came to understand that this was quite a legitimate practice. And I then sought to, being a filmmaker, I sought to make a documentary about this wonderful practice of communication with the other side. I was joined by my then co-producer, Tim Coleman. Tim and I traveled across the United States and to several European countries over a period of about 10 years or more, and collected a huge amount of footage, interviews, and so on, of people who had been practicing EVP and other aspects of afterlife research. We also spent some time with the folks who had done the SCOLE experiment. This was an amazing experiment in physical mediumship that had been conducted in the tiny English town of SCOLE. It's about half-hour northeast of Cambridge. It's a really small town. You can walk across it in about 45 seconds. It goes back well beyond the 16th century, though. A beautiful place. And in this town, there was a particular farmhouse that was owned at the time by Robin and Sandra Foy, who had been doing physical mediumship for most of their lifetime, physical mediumship research. And they were joined by others, including a particular couple who were both mental mediums. And together they conducted this experiment that went on for 5 years, 500 sessions. And in the course of their work, they they managed I mean, let me go back a step. The other participants in this experiment were what they call their spirit team. This is a group of folks on the other side who worked back and forth with them to create experiments to see how much physical phenomena could be produced. And over the 5 years, they managed to do incredible things. They had photographic phenomena, things that images that were impressed on photographic film, voices that came out of midair, electronic communications, materializations, apports. Apports are objects that were brought from some other point in space and time, and it just sort of dropped out of thin air and came down with a thud on their table. One of these, to me, one of the most amazing ones, and I held this in my hand when we visited SCOLE, was a newspaper published during the war years of the 1940s. They were in communication with a British medium who actually had been arrested during the World War II because she somehow came out with information that turned out to be military secrets. And she was jailed for that and suffered for it. And so as they were discussing this newspaper evidently materialized and fell on their table. And on the front page was a feature story about this medium.
Yeah. And you know, as is the case in a lot of the things that we are interested in and study, this so-called non-physical phenomena. I mean, the SCOLE group, came under some scrutiny and criticism and certain accusations. But as you point out in the book, I mean, they were studied by some pretty credible people. You have David Fontana.
Sure.
I think John Mack was part of the investigators, but these are not people that are easily fooled, and they found no evidence of fraud, and so
Right. This was a team from the British SPR, Society for Psychical Research,
yeah,
and these
yeah.
were properly skeptical investigators. Monty Keane and David Fontana,
Right.
and what was his name? The electrical engineer. I'll think of it in a minute. They spent 2 years. They attended sessions for 2 years. And found no fraud there. In fact, they issued a 200-300 page scientific report on it. The folks who doubted it at the SPR were those who had made one visit to one session.
Right. Yeah.
So,
and I mean, physical mediumship is always questioned by people, and yet there was some just incredible physical mediums, especially during the Victorian era, and then in the early 1900s, that produced all sorts of phenomena under controlled conditions. One thing that always troubled me when I started studying physical mediumship was that some of these great mediums of yesteryear performed all of these, produced all of these, the various phenomena in broad daylight. And most of the mediums today, the physical mediums that are still practicing, insist on total darkness, which makes it very, very difficult to investigate or to form any opinion. So I never could reconcile. I had physical mediums tell me that, that ectoplasm that exudes from their body gets affected by light, and when it gets reabsorbed, it could cause physical harm. But I didn't know how to reconcile that with how come the mediums of yesteryear weren't harmed by that?
That's interesting. I'm not that thoroughly familiar with the early days of physical mediumship. I know that much of the physical mediumship practice today does require darkness or near darkness. Some can do it in very dim red light and so on. But what we think of as the conventional 19th century approach did involve a closed cabinet and so on. The thing about SCOLE, that one of the reasons I was so fascinated with it, is that while it took place in a darkened room, and a room that was below ground, it was very little, there was good radio silence down there. all of everything in the room had luminous tabs on it. Everyone wore luminous bracelets. And so while you could not see objects too well, the chances of any hanky-panky taking place were actually rather slim. They built the table so people couldn't reach under it and so on. They took huge precautions. And those who investigated SCOLE over this period of years, I mean, they knew all the tricks that fake mediums pull, and they could find none there.
Right. You started talking about, in your early years being fascinated with UFOs and that phenomenon. And one of the questions that we get asked a lot is that, assuming that there is sentient life on other planets, and I think we have a lot of credible evidence that we're being visited. When those that live on other planets physically die, does their consciousness go to the same afterlife that we go to? Or do you think that there are different dimensions, based upon where you live? Any thoughts about that?
Well, here's my understanding, and this comes from, among other things, from a relationship now of about 6 years with a wonderful team of mediums. We call ourselves the Cosmic Voices team. We have a website. It's Cosmic Voices, one word, cosmicvoices.network, not .net. It's .network, cosmicvoices.network. And the two main mediums are Jean Love and Regina Ochoa. They are probably best known for having channeled the NASA astronauts who died in the two shuttle disasters, the Challenger and the Columbia. And a lot of this channeling is on a website that's was put together by the Foundation for Mind Being Research here in Silicon Valley in California. And I have spent a lot of time with these women, and I'm sort of the webmaster of the website, collecting all this material. And from the aggregate of the messages that we have gotten, plus other reading and other things I've done, my sense of it is that what we call the afterlife is what you might term a holographic matrix of consciousness, made out of consciousness. In other words, it has no fixed structures other than what we with our consciousness give them. As far as other planets are concerned, my impression is that they're not just other planets, but whole other universes that we may visit in our afterlives after we have received sufficient preparation for it. And it is said to be endlessly fascinating and enlightening, and you've heard it all as well, I'm sure. But it ain't so simple as it's not even simple enough for our language to contain.
Right, and you have a whole section in your book about language, so
right.
Which is interesting. What I find is it's very difficult when it comes to typically in mental mediumship. We think that the primary focus of somebody that's gone to the other side, as we like to call it, is to let their loved ones here in the physical realm know that they still exist. And you do that through specific short pieces of evidence that the sitter will recognize. I know that we recently completed a study for the Bigelow Institute where the purpose of the experiment, was to glean wisdom from the other side. And it's very difficult. Mental mediums don't usually give you descriptions of what the other side is like because they're focused on, the people and the discarnates are communicating specific pieces of evidence. And it's hard enough to receive that and put it into language. And, as opposed to getting these long essays about the other side. However, some of the mediums that you're working with are channeling, and that's where we can get, these long descriptions of pithy things, so it's quite,
It also depends on what questions are asked and
yeah,
what people are interested in, whether it's a channeler or one who does transmediumship. They generally try to respond to and serve people and give them what they need. And I'm personally curious about everything, so I ask everything.
right.
And Gene and Regina are wonderful, and they could actually do anything from what they call taking dictation, where they hear the words or the intentions in their head, and then they will write it out. Anything from that to full trance channeling,
Yeah.
and that is fascinating to watch when that happens, because the personal body language and gestures and voice and everything are to a great extent replaced by the personality of who's coming through. It's a very strenuous thing. In fact, Jean can hardly do it anymore. She's getting on and has health issues. And so she's doing everything up to that point of full physical mediumship.
Yeah.
If you go to our website, you'll see examples of what they've been bringing through, and it's
Right.
quite amazing.
Yeah, and you raise an interesting point, because what I've noticed over the past 20 years is that quite a number of mediums develop, health issues, and um, it stands to reason, because they're always, the person in spirit is working through them, and they'll say things like, I feel a crushing in my chest. Did your
Mm.
loved one pass of a heart attack, and things like that? So they're empathic, and they're also absorbing all this energy, and it has to take a toll on their physical bodies. Some people, have been typing in questions, and we had one where um, she'd like to know if there is a place that we go before we reach our final destination, in the other realm. And I mean, you get into some of that, in the book. I mean, there seems to be, um, we believe that there's progression on the other side, where initially we may be among people of like mind, and but even those,
Or within our own soul group.
right,
Right.
which is,
Sorry.
yeah. Um, Soul groups are another whole concept, but I guess that it makes sense that we gravitated, and we synchronize with people that are of like mind. But people always ask about afterlife justice. They want to know that the miserable SOBs on this earth don't go to the same place that they do. So, but I think
Well,
the
I can speak to that to some extent.
yeah,
My impression, and I hasten to say this is my impression. I don't claim to have definitive knowledge. My impression is that those who have not evolved, let's say, gravitate to realms that are in harmony with their being. In other words, a murderer may well find themselves in a rather dark place. And I don't know, have you seen the movie No Solar, the Brazilian feature movie about the afterlife?
I haven't, no.
Okay, well, the protagonist is a wealthy gentleman who was a fairly selfish individual in his lifetime. He dies of a heart attack, and he finds himself in a very dark place. It's kind of a Hollywood cliche of hell, with fires burning and people shrieking and so on. And he kind of gets into a worse and worse place, and then he sees at a distance some people who have come in as rescuers, and they're rescuing another soul. And he realizes that all he has to do is ask for help. And if he asks for help, he is pulled out of that bad place, which is really, it's really a projection of his own consciousness ultimately. Or his own consciousness adds to the misery of the place. You could look at it that way as well. And he's brought to a healing center, kind of a hospital, if you will. And during the first scenes of his life there, we see him still kind of pulling fast ones on people. He's still being manipulated. And this he's eventually healed, let's say. And one of the things he's first permitted to do is to go visit his family down below. And he sees how they're speaking of him. And they're not speaking that well of him. And that's part of his healing process, to realize, to take responsibility for his attitudes and his actions in his physical life. And eventually he evolves and so on, because it's a movie. But it was actually a story channeled by Chico Xavier, who was a very well-known Brazilian psychic and medium and author and philanthropist, and very well regarded in Brazil.
Yeah. And along those lines, I mean, what we've learned from near-death experiencers is that, which is really, compelling, is that many talk about this life review, where, along with what you're saying, I mean, they get to see their whole life flash before their eyes, and they get to feel the good that they've imparted onto others, and conversely, they get to feel the ill that they cause to others. And I would imagine that doesn't feel so good, which is an incentive, to live a better life. But the take-home message is that, as you were alluding to, it's all about self-judgment as opposed to a deity that says you go here or you go there.
Right.
We go where we belong. So I think that is something that we all can learn from the experiences that come back to tell us what life is like. You
Now,
you were going to say something?
but before we go on,
Yeah.
I'm curious. I'm not that familiar with how you yourself got into this whole field of interest and study. What was the hinge point for you?
Well, 23 years ago, I was a logical left brain thinker that thought that the afterlife was a fairy tale. I mean, that's we were, consciousness was an epiphenomenon of our brains. We are our brains. Our brains die. That's the end. Just final. And then, one day my wife woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, shaking and trembling and ashen white, and she wouldn't even talk. And I said, "What's the matter?" And she just stared at me with blank eyes. And I said, "Well, what's the matter?" And she finally said, "Something horrible is going to happen today." And I said, "Well, what does that mean? Do you have any details?" She said, I can't tell you, but our lives are going to be changed forever today." And I was, even though I didn't believe, in things that went beyond the brain, my wife had always been very intuitive. We worked together for many, many years, and she sometimes had these precognitive visions, sort of what you had, and everything always played out exactly the way she told me they would, but they were all good things. But logic told me if she was right then, she could be right now. And to make a long story short, I watched over my 3 kids. One was back in college already. Another one was going back to college the next day. And my youngest one was working a part-time job the last day before going back to high school. I let my guard down at night, something that I regret. And I let it fade from my awareness. And we were all in a restaurant. We had 2 cars, and my son and my daughter left, and were in a horrible accident. My daughter didn't survive, and my son had serious brain injuries.
Oh
And
dear.
and then I obviously I was in a state of shock, not knowing whether I was going to lose 1 or 2 kids. And then after it became clear that my son was going to survive, it suddenly dawned on me, like that morning. I said, "Wait a second, how did Fran, how did my wife know? Because she clearly knew. So that started me on this journey of uh, crossing, going across the United States, meeting with medical doctors and scientists and researchers that studied the mind and consciousness. I want to know if there were any real credible people that had any real evidence about many of the things that you write about in your book. And then, that was also intertwined with grief, and eventually, we formed a family foundation, which is kind of a merging of science and spirituality, which are not mutually exclusive, as you well know. Sometimes you talk to physicists and they sound like spiritualists. They're all talking about the same thing, a single
Right.
point of light. We're all connected, entanglement, and so forth. But yeah, I'm a totally different person than I was. I never had that spiritual inner knowledge that many possess. And then I dismissed it. And frankly, after my
Also,
yeah,
speaking of that, I have another question.
yeah.
Is I came from the East Coast, New Jersey, New York area.
Yeah,
But
I grew up
you're
in I
there as
grew up in Brooklyn.
right. Where are you now?
Right now, I'm in Sanibel Island of Florida.
Oh, wonderful.
Right.
And when I moved to California, which I went back in the 70s, uh, for the first year I was out here, people would say, "Oh, you're from New York, aren't you?"
Yeah,
And I knew that part of what that meant was that my energy was very yang and so on. But visiting the East Coast again, I also realized that you might say the ambient energy there is not that conducive to seeing beyond the materialist framework, but particularly the New York area. And New
right.
York's a wonderful place, and I'm glad I'm from there. And the atmosphere there just was not right for me.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons I moved west. Did you have that same experience in the Northeast and in the New York area?
Oh, well, it's interesting you say that because um, my wife passed away 4 years ago, and I've been
Mm.
for the past year. I've been in a relationship with a woman in Pacific Palisades. She's
Oh,
an actor
no.
out there.
How,
Um,
how did how did she do in the fires?
she lost everything. She
Oh,
lost she lost her home, her daughter's
oh,
home, and a granddaughter's home.
I'm so
And
sorry.
as we speak, she and her daughter are each driving their cars across the country because they're moving
Oh,
because they have nothing left. But the reason
wow.
I said it was interesting is because I was spending a lot of time out in L.A. and I'm being from Brooklyn. I'm not an L.A. kind of guy, so and it was like another world to me. It was like traveling to another dimension.
Right. It is. And in fact, LA and San Francisco are very different.
Yeah,
There isn't one California. We up in the north. We're more of a northern city, actually.
right.
So but LA is the cliche that East Coasters think of when they think of California, and rightly so.
Yeah. And
I'm
and
sorry. Go ahead.
I'm a
Yeah.
cliche to them of what they think is living here. Yeah. Man, I do the same as you. I mean, my accent is evidently more pronounced than yours, but I'll be doing interviews and like 30 seconds in, the interviewer will say, "So where in New York are you from?" It's like, what
Well,
do you
I was
say?
lucky. I grew up halfway between New York and Philadelphia, so
Oh, okay.
I didn't catch either of those strong accents.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bob.
So, getting back to, there was something in your book that I really liked that you wrote. I mean, you were making a music analogy, like playing the piano, but what you were relating is that you kind of define death as liberating our consciousness and regaining the full spectrum of light and sound and all frequencies that remain hidden. That's a good definition of death, you know,
Well,
regaining what we once had.
my sense of it, Bob, is that a small minority of the entirety of our being is spent here in the physical dimension. One thing that all of this has led me to is, and it actually led at one point to a direct experience of what we call eternity. this is just a funny story. I have been watching. Had you seen the channeling Eric videos on YouTube?
No, I haven't.
Eric was this troubled kid who lived in Texas. His mom is a physician, actually, very skeptical. Anyway, Eric took his own life, and what happened was he then started pulling pranks on his friends, and these stories got back to his mother. So she found a medium, Jamie Butler, over in Atlanta, and started doing Skype sessions with her where Jamie would channel Eric. And Eric's mom is quite a character, and she asks questions the rest of us would feel uncomfortable asking. And this one video, it was one of the early videos, she asks Eric, well, Eric, what was it like to shoot yourself? I mean, who would ask a question that blunt? But she asked it. And Eric replied very calmly, I never heard the shot. I suddenly found myself in a different environment. And then she asks, well, are souls born and do they die? And Eric says, well, you have to understand, Mama, that time is not the same here as it is where you are. And for some reason, when he says that, I experience eternity. Don't know why that triggered it. But my first reaction was, oh my God, eternity is not just an infinite extension of time. It's something absolutely and completely different.
It's everything all at once.
Right, kind of. And our experience of time in this physical sphere, this physical dimension, is just one way that the pie of eternity can be sliced, if you will. When you get even intellectually the notion of eternity and infinity, then a lot of this stuff falls into place. The cosmologists are now looking more beyond the Big Bang, for example. Well, if there was a Big Bang, something had to be some energy or whatever you call it to precede it, and so on. But if you take that to its ultimate conclusion, then where you're at is there never was a beginning and there never will be an end. And right. Since there is something rather than nothing at all, that something, whether it's just the primordial energy of which all this is a slowed down, crystallized version, must always have existed. And over time, I found that not so difficult to come to terms with. Does that make sense to you, Bob?
It does, absolutely. And also you and I and everybody else that we know uses the term afterlife. It's really a poor term because it's just life. It's a continuum.
Right. And it sort of trivializes it. As I say in my book, it's like, the tail that kids used to pin on donkeys, is sort of a trivial appendage at the end of the real thing, right?
Right.
I think it's probably wise to at least grant it equal status. At least equal status.
I think so.
Yeah.
Because I just wanted to get back, the calling Earth and EVP, and some people, most of our audience is familiar with, electronic voice phenomena. But what I've noticed, and I'm curious if you have noticed the same thing, is that some people just are naturally able to get these recordings while others are not. So some, get a tremendous number of them, and which suggests that, it's been suggested that people that do the recording, the experimenters, are acting as mediums when they're getting, these voices. Do you agree with that? Some people better inclined to receive these communications?
I think it's probably a good theory. It makes sense. We don't know how it works, why it works, when it works, and when it doesn't. Some people say, oh, it works better during the waxing phase of the moon, or one thing or another. We just don't know, because there's really no way to do a proper scientific study of it. And by scientific, I mean just an honest inquiry, right?
Right.
Not one that necessarily gets down to the physics of the root causes, but even just a survey of because I'm sure that a lot more people are doing this and even doing it successfully than will admit to it. And that gets back down to the question of what's paranormal or not. I get this, and as you say, the longest chapter in my book is about semantics and how the language around this tends to encapsulate our understanding. And one of the big boogeymen there is the word paranormal. How do we know if it's normal or paranormal if we can't talk about it?
Right.
When I was doing a lot of UFO research earlier in my life, I'd ask a lot of people just casually, I say, have you ever had an experience or a sighting or whatever? And they say, no, 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 come on. And then they say, oh, wait a minute. There's this thing that happened when I was 14 years old. And it would all start tumbling out. And this happened more often than you would think. And so what if all the scientists and academics who need to keep their mouth shut, basically, were to come out and start discussing these things with each other?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, and that's one of the things we try to do in the foundation is to encourage people to just simply talk about their experiences more. The more they talk about it, the more mainstream it'll become, and the less stigma attached to it. But I mean, I'll tell you a quick story that you'll appreciate with your work. About 2 years after my daughter had passed, I went to see a family doctor, and he was a friend of mine. And I don't remember why I went to see him. I had some ailment, and yeah, I hadn't seen him in 2 years. And I go into his office, and he says, "Bob, what have you been up to?" I said, "You really want to know?" He says, "Yeah." I said, "Well, I've been studying survival of consciousness." And he just looked at me, and we started talking more and more. And then about 10 minutes later, he says, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "What?" He says, "What's survival of consciousness?" And I told him, but I started talking about the things that you've written,
Yeah.
whatever. And then he's listening, and then his nurse walked in the room, and she had just lost a child to crib death, and she was
Ooh.
obviously interested in what we've been talking about. Now we're talking about this stuff for like 40 minutes, and there's like 40 people in his waiting room, probably having a riot. He never did ask me why I was there medically. But
Mm.
she leaves the room, and then he gets this real serious look on his face, and he said, "Bob, can I tell you something?" And I said, "What?" And he says, "My father died 8 years ago." I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know that." And he says, "Yeah." And he died in the morning, and I had a lot of critically ill patients in the hospital, and I had to call my answering service. Um, and I did. And when I called, they said, "Oh, doctor, your father called," which he was stunned. And he said, "My father died at 9 o'clock this morning." And they said, "Oh, sorry, I was so sorry, doctor. I was so sorry. We must have gotten the message wrong. He must have said your father-in-law." He says, "My father-in-law has been dead for 16 years." He said, "What
Mm.
time did the call come in?" And they said 9:15. And he said, "Read me back the message." And they said the message was, "Hi, it's me. I'm okay." I mean, and the point is,
Yeah.
it had been 18 years. He never told his wife. He never told his children. He certainly didn't tell any of his colleagues. But after he heard the stuff coming out of my mouth, he knew I wasn't going to judge him.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then the shame of it all is that now 20 years have gone by, and I guarantee you he's never mentioned it to anybody
Yeah.
again. So how sad is that? That he had to hold this in instead of just simply
Right.
saying what happened, for fear of
Right.
being judged and labeled.
Of course. Of course. It's totally understandable. I
Yeah.
some years ago I met several women who had been nurses in a children's cancer ward, and they had all kinds of experiences to report. And one time I considered doing a documentary about these women. I eventually didn't do it, but I had plans to do it. And the title of the film was going to be "Don't Tell the Doctor."
Don't, don't tell the doctor. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the Pam Reynolds case?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Tim and I interviewed her, in Atlanta, and then we went to Phoenix to interview Dr. Spetzler, who had performed the standstill operation on her, and that was very interesting. He was a brilliant man, and he would go so far as to say, "I have no way of understanding what happened." And we knew he knew what was up, and he just could not
bring himself to
could
say
not bring it. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
You know, so what I wanted to ask you, I mean, obviously you've been looking into this stuff for a long time, and in your book, you talk about, near-death experiences and reincarnation, mediumship, after-death communications, EVP, terminal lucidity, dream visitations, deathbed visions, the whole gamut. After all these years and after doing all of this research and interviewing all these people, is there one discipline of research that you think is the most evidential in suggesting life beyond physical death?
Wow. Well, that's a great question, and I'm hard pressed to answer it off the top of my head. And one of the reasons that I was attracted to instrumental transcommunication, EVP, and so on, is that it seems, when you really look into it, it seems to have the hardest evidence, and the most interesting and sophisticated body of evidence. And so I would say if more people were doing that, and if there were really legitimate studies of that that really went deep, that I think that to me would be the route to take. But there's so much lore that hasn't been recorded, like phone calls from those on the other side. There have been studies done about that, but do we have the recordings? That's the hard material evidence is not the be all and end all. But if we want to change the paradigm for those for who that gives it the stamp of truth, then I think it's important to do that. And meanwhile, those who go beyond it and do however they do. But I think, I would say that the electronic communications, because they can be recorded,
right, and we have
probably constitute most tangible evidence,
because we can perceive it with our own physical senses. I think one of the best explanation I heard was Bruce Grayson was once presenting at one of our conferences, and he summed up by saying, "Look," he says, "we could explain away, some disciplines. You can present arguments against NDEs and reincarnation and this and that." He says, "But when you step back and you examine everything as a whole, the argument that makes the most sense is that we're more than our physical bodies and we survive physical, So
because they all fit together.
They do. Yeah, that's right.
I have a friend down in San Diego who has a young son. And as soon as this little kid could talk, he started saying, "Oh, Mama, this area used to be part of Mexico. And the buildings look different, and they were like this," and so on. And she, of course, did her homework and found out this was all true. And again, that is one field where I'm sure would be very fertile if people really started looking into it, because it's automatically dismissed as imaginary.
Right, or that it's a psi phenomenon, extracting information from a field of information, all sorts of arguments. But one thing, I mean, are you in an agreement that reincarnation appears to be a choice as opposed to something that we all do?
That's a very good question. It's one of the big questions, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that it is a choice, and that choice comes from a part of us that's not part of our human ego. It's a part of us that has an overview that we in our current state cannot have. And again, this gets back to the limitations of language. What do you mean by me? What do you mean by you? Our language is geared to our culture and the limitations of our culture.
Yeah.
So I would give your answer a qualified yes. And with the caveat that our conceptual range is only so broad.
Yeah. And as you know, one of the common things reported from near-death experiencers is that they reach a certain point and then they are told, that they have to come back because it's not their time. And that suggests that um, our lives are predetermined, with a general, exit point.
Mm.
Um,
And plus,
so,
we're also told that there are other possible exit points built into our lives
right.
that we can take without a penalty score.
Right.
I think that's
That,
probably simply honors that this really is the school of hard knocks here, and not all souls are totally prepared for it. But
yeah, I
sorry, go
know a lot of people will say, my wife used to say it, that
ahead.
this is hell. Yeah,
Yeah,
the physical realm, but where we're going
yeah,
is a lot better.
yeah. It gets better. I was going to ask you. I don't know how much more time do we have, Bob?
We only have about 2 or 3 minutes left.
Oh dear. Okay.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to ask you about the phenomenon that you witnessed in your kitchen.
Oh, well, that was an interesting story because we were talking about our daughter. My wife and I, we were
Mm.
driving home from someplace, and I walked into the kitchen, and we gave that clip to Netflix, as you saw. So I don't know, with 9 or 12 those hi-hat lights, and they in two separate sessions for over about 15, 20 minutes, they was like a Fourth of July light show.
Mm.
But the next day, as an open-minded skeptic of all things, I had an electrician at the house the next day at 9 o'clock in the morning, and he took down all 12 of the lights to inspect them, and he found nothing wrong. So then I had him take apart all the light switches, and he found nothing wrong. And I had lived in the house at that time for 10 years. And nothing like that had ever happened. And I also lived in the house 10 years after that, and nothing like that ever happened. So
Right,
for me, I had to rule out the physical explanations to
right,
accept the non-physical, and then that made the non-physical experience even more meaningful and strong, And
right,
I
right.
think that sometimes we have a tendency to accept everything, as a sign, and not everything is a sign. And I think we have to approach it that way.
Right. And I think
Um,
you did the right thing by being properly skeptical and having having the electrician come in.
yeah,
And
I
and
mean,
that's
that's just the way I am.
strengthening.
Most people won't do that. I
Right.
wanted to tell everybody, we have been talking with Dan Drasin. It's an excellent book. We're going to add it to our recommended reading.
Thank you.
It's called A New Science of the Afterlife, Space, Time, and the Consciousness Code. You could read about Dan's work. You can on his website, Dan Drasin, DRASIN.com. He also has the links in there to his Calling Earth documentary. I know we had it on our website for many years.
Yeah,
Um,
it's now on the films page on my website. I've put it on
okay.
there as well.
Okay, great. So I encourage you to do that. Dan's an explorer. He's a gifted filmmaker, and follow his work. He'll never stop exploring and and learning as something we should all strive for. Dan, thanks so much for being with us today. I hope to talk to you again, and be well.
Yeah, let's continue our conversation sometime, Bob. Thank
Okay,
you.
thanks. Take care.
Bye.
And that does it for us tonight. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye now.